World News tonight, the child abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. In Boston, the church pulls out of the deal to compensate victims. A surge in the number of Americans who cannot find a job. The economists say this means bad news and good news about the economy. The flight that became a nightmare from Australia to San Francisco. And honoring Rosie the Riveter, the women who toiled in the arsenal of democracy during World War II.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin in Boston tonight, where after many months of scandal, the Roman Catholic Church has decided to reject a financial settlement with 86 people who say they are victims of sexual abuse by a single priest. We go first to ABC's Ron Claiborne, who is in Boston, for an explanation. Ron?
Peter, the Archdiocese, the Finance Committee of the Archdiocese, in the end decided that the price tag of the settlement with the victims of priest John Gagin, ex-priest John Gagin, estimated to be up to $30 million, was simply too expensive. They could not afford it. And more importantly, they said it would have set too high a standard for settling cases with future victims of abusive priests. And Peter, this is going to make a lot of people here very angry, and surely we'll see calls for Cardinal Law again to step down.
I was going to say a lot more pressure on the Cardinal himself. As Ron well knows, it was another significant development for the church up there today. Father Paul Shanley says he is willing to return to Massachusetts to stand trial for the rape of a young boy. Ron, we give it back to you.
That's right, Peter. Father Shanley could have held up this process if he wanted to fight it for as long as a month or even 2 months, but in the end he decided not to fight it.
Father Shanley said little in court before signing the waiver allowing authorities to bring him to Massachusetts.
He wanted to go back to Massachusetts to address these charges. That's why he waived it. Why he didn't feel it was necessary to delay this proceeding.
Prosecutors in Massachusetts said today Shanley could face additional charges of molesting other children.
There are other credible witnesses in this case. If other charges are appropriate, we will bring them.
In Boston today, the governor signed legislation requiring clergy to report suspected child abuse, including past incidents, to law enforcement within 30 days.
Unfortunately, as we all know, this legislation comes too late for too many.
Many people, including lawyers for Shanley's alleged victims, say the legislation would not have been necessary if Cardinal Bernard Law had reported priests accused of abusing children to police.
Paul Shanley was nurtured, protected, and financed by the Archdiocese long after they knew about his deviant views on man-boy love, as well as his predatory behavior.
In a statement last night, Bishop John McCormick of New Hampshire, a former top aide to Cardinal Law, said that was not the case.
The file I reviewed on Father Shanley did not contain any allegations of sexual abuse. It is clear to me now that there was significant information about Paul Shanley that I never saw.
Bishop McCormick and Cardinal Law say poor record-keeping kept them from knowing the full extent of the allegations against Father Shanley.
It may take as long as a week to actually transfer Father Shanley from California to Massachusetts. And Peter, the rape charge that he faces here carries a maximum sentence of life in prison.
Thanks very much, Ron Claiborne, in Boston tonight, where the Catholic Church stays at the very center of crisis. Now to the other news today. The government said the country's unemployment rate hit its highest level in more than 7 years last month. 6% of Americans were out of work and looking for a job in April. That is up from 5.7% the month before. ABC's Betsy Starkey's here. We know this reflects some weakness in the economy, but it's not a completely dark picture, is it?
Peter, it sounds confusing, but it is not unusual for the unemployment rate to rise when the economy begins to recover. Basically, when the economy comes out of a recession, businesses are nervous about the future and reluctant to hire back the permanent employees they laid off at the end of the recession, some of whom are just now showing up in the unemployment rate.
Today's employment report is evidence of what economists call a jobless recovery. The economy is growing, but not fast enough to create many new jobs. 8.6 million Americans are now unemployed and looking for work, soon to be joined by 1 million+ college graduates, many already feeling dejected.
No matter where you look, there's just not a lot of openings.
The National Association of Colleges and Employers, which tracks college job trends, says hiring of college grads is down 36% this year.
So I started in late February to look for a job, and still don't have anything.
There were some job gains in April, the biggest for temporary employees who are typically among the first hired in a recovery. Because they get no benefits, employers find them less costly to take on than permanent workers.
The big question is whether today's report is a sign not only that the recovery is weak, but that it has lost whatever momentum it had. Either way, few economists expect a decline in the unemployment rate right away, Peter.
Many thanks. Betsy Stark. Not to be too glib about it, but at the Pentagon today, you could probably see the steam rising. The Secretary of Defense wants to know who it is in the Army that is trying to keep an $11 billion weapons program called the Crusader, which the Secretary believes should be abandoned, in place. Whomever it is, they have gone around Mr. Rumsfeld. ABC's Martha Raddatz reports from the Pentagon.
The battle is getting even nastier over the 40-ton self-propelled cannon. The Pentagon's investigation will determine who went behind Donald Rumsfeld's back to try to save the Crusader from Rumsfeld's axe.
Anyone who may be responsible for inappropriate behavior will be held accountable.
Rumsfeld is the face of America's war on terrorism. Tough, powerful, and enormously popular, he wants the Crusader killed. And he expected everyone to fall in line behind him.
Ought a president and a secretary of defense and a deputy secretary of defense be able to expect that the leadership and the overwhelming majority will in fact be supportive once a decision is made? Of course.
Some in the Army were so outraged by Rumsfeld's intentions, they sent a 2-page letter with talking points to Capitol Hill. The letter goes straight for the gut, saying, a decision to kill Crusader puts soldiers at risk. And this, the Office of the Secretary of Defense is looking for a quick kill to demonstrate their political prowess and their commitment to transformation.
He's going to run into a real hostile battleground here on Capitol Hill.
Because long before September 11th, Rumsfeld made a lot of enemies.
Rumsfeld became seen as the quiet guy who was fixing to kill most of the military systems the services cherish, and doing this without any consultation.
It is widely believed that Rumsfeld is a tough player. Whether he wins or loses this battle for the Crusader, there will likely be casualties along the way. Martha Raddatz, ABC News, the Pentagon.
Now, some other international news now. One of the FBI's 10 most wanted men has been captured in Mexico a day after he was added to the FBI list. Ruben Martinez Hernandez is accused of several rapes in Tennessee 4 years ago. In Afghanistan today, British forces on foot have begun searching caves and bunkers in the southeastern part of the country. They are part of the ongoing search for al-Qaeda fighters who are believed to be hiding there. This week, there's a potentially more significant development in Afghanistan, the mass migration of hundreds of thousands of Afghanistans going home. ABC's Jim Shudo reports from Kabul.
Shamsuddin is on the road to Kabul, about to finish a journey that began 16 years ago. He's one of the millions of Afghans who left because of war and spent years in neighboring Pakistan. Shamsuddin's 6 children are seeing Afghanistan for the first time. In the past, peace never lasted long, he told us, but we've never felt as safe as we do now. They stop at a UN camp on the outskirts of the capital, a way station for about 4,000 refugees every day.
Afghanistan's refugees fled the Soviet occupation, civil war, the rise of the Taliban, and most recently the U.S. bombing campaign. Now, for the first time in more than 20 years, large numbers of them are returning home.
450,000 in the last 2 months alone. Eventually, more than 1 million are expected to come back. One of the largest and fastest repatriations the UN has ever handled. They are given food, medical care, and training on how to avoid landmines. But beyond the lure of home, Afghanistan has very little to offer these people. Jobs are almost non-existent, food is scarce, schools are already overcrowded, and safe, decent housing is hard to find. On this afternoon, Shamsuddin arrives back at the home he left in 1986, or what's left of it. It was ruined during the Civil War. He says it will take him 6 months to rebuild it. Until then, like most returnees, he relies on the generosity of relatives. His family of 8 plus another family of 6 will live in these 3 rooms.
At the end of the day, this country is going to be built by Afghans. And the fact that they are returning back to their country is a good sign.
Shamsuddin told us the rain was a good omen. There have been 4 years of drought. Now Allah is blessing us. We're finally home. Jim Sciutto, ABC News, Kabul.
When we come back this evening, fervent support. The Christian fundamentalists for the government of Israel. And also on the broadcast tonight, the terrible flight from down under, 50 hours too long. And industrial strength women, they powered the U.S. through World War II from the home front.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Viagra.
The Israeli army went back into the Palestinian city of Nablus this morning and attacked a building. Israelis said it was a hideout for extremists. An Israeli soldier and 2 Palestinians died. In Washington today, about 200 conservative Christian leaders showed up at the Israeli embassy to express their support. Yesterday, both the House and the Senate passed a resolution of solidarity with Israel, even though the White House said it created complications for the president. Israel is lobbying conservative Christians in the country very deliberately. ABC's John Cochran reports from Washington tonight.
In just 2 minutes, we'll be driving next to the military cemetery of Jerusalem.
For many Americans, it's a frightening time to visit Jerusalem. But these conservative Christians from Colorado were determined to show their support for Israel.
This is their land. It was God gave this land to Israel.
Some evangelicals believe the second coming of Christ can happen only when Israel is in control of the Holy Land. Many Israeli officials regard support from conservative Christians as just as important as the backing of Jewish Americans. In Arlington, Virginia, a Presbyterian minister is president of Christians for Israel.
The support in Congress, certainly in the Republican Party, is a result of the grassroots support of Israel among Christians.
To help maintain that support, the Israeli Ministry of Tourism has hired an American marketing firm to target 5 million evangelical supporters. Many are offered cut-rate trips and meetings with Israeli officials.
Arafat is the instigator of the terror.
Evangelists on TV are especially important to the Israeli government. So are 1,600 Christian radio hosts.
Who's the perpetrator of evil here? The Israelis who are trying to say we're going to deal with terrorism, or the terrorist who sets a trap and blows them to smithereens?
When President Bush suddenly sounded tough with Israel, conservative Christians organized an email campaign for 100,000 evangelicals.
Us putting that friendly pressure on, I think, helps the president stay on the right track.
And the White House does listen when conservative Christians complain. With another election in sight, they are a top priority. John Cochran, ABC News, Washington.
In the national briefing tonight, more than half a dozen pipe bombs have been found in rural mailboxes in Illinois and Iowa. The Postal Service says at least 5 people were injured in explosions, including 3 postal workers. The Postal Service thinks the bombs were placed directly in the mailboxes and not mailed. They were attached to notes, or notes were attached to them, threatening the government. In Appalachia, heavy rains in West Virginia, and Kentucky have flooded rivers and killed at least 3 people. 14 others are missing after rising rivers swept away entire homes. Florida's state attorney says Rilia Wilson, the 5-year-old girl who went missing for 15 months before anyone noticed, will now be treated as a homicide. Her godmother says she was taken away by someone claiming to represent the state's child welfare agency. And Lady Bird Johnson has suffered a mild stroke. Mrs. Johnson's doctors say she has lost the ability to speak, and it is unclear whether she will regain it. Otherwise, the former First Lady is said to be alert and in good spirits. When we come back, why did it take 64 hours to get these passengers to their destination when it should have taken about a dozen? In San Francisco today, passengers on board a United Airlines flight finally arrived from Australia after 3 previous flights were aborted. which is why we mean finally arrived. Here's ABC's Judy Muller.
The flight from hell began routinely enough. Wednesday afternoon, some 200 passengers got on United Flight 862 in Sydney, bound for San Francisco. But then, 4 hours out, terrible turbulence. The plane was diverted to Auckland, New Zealand. Ambulances took the injured, some with broken bones, to local hospitals. Others lined up for buses to local hotels, sharing tales of turbulence.
The plane went up and then Dad wasn't seated in properly on the little pathway. Up he went like a floating balloon and then down he came with a thump.
Thursday, the passengers boarded Flight 862 again, although a different plane. A plane that never got off the ground. It sat on the tarmac for 4 hours, then headed back to the gate.
And there was a noise in the engine that they couldn't determine what was causing the problem, so they took us off that plane.
Once again, passengers cleared customs for another overnight stay. Friday morning, they boarded for the third time and soon realized they were on the same plane that hit turbulence on Wednesday.
We knew that it was the same plane because the wine stains were still on the console.
The plane finally departed Auckland, but several hours into the flight, the pilot was forced to turn back.
They made an announcement and said that there was a leak, there was a compression leak, and that it was to do with the wings and with landing.
Another emergency landing. The passengers were beginning to show signs of wear. Hours later, those brave enough to hang in there got on the plane one more time. More than 11 hours later, Friday afternoon, San Francisco time, they finally reached their destination.
The trip from hell, all they did was just, waiting in line, staying at cheap motels, not getting fed.
Total elapsed time for the flight from hell, 64 hours and 19 minutes. Judy Muller, ABC News, Los Angeles.
A report today in The Economist magazine says the world's airline passengers have accumulated more than 8 trillion unredeemed frequent flyer miles. Far more than the airlines can ever supply in free seats. The magazine says the miles are worth $500 billion. When we come back, the final item in the broadcast tonight, the arsenal of democracy and the women who made it so. Finally from us this evening, the women who helped to win the Second World War. This weekend, dozens of women who worked for the war effort will be in Seattle, where so much of the country's Air Force was built. They were among the millions of women who served, and they will be honored for their service 60 years ago and their profound influence on the war effort. In Seattle, Washington, 79-year-old Margaret Berry is helping restore a World War II B-29 bomber. Memories of the war are never far away.
Right now, I'm called Margaret.
But they used to call her Rosie.
She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter.
When World War II began and millions of American men left their jobs to enlist, wartime industry needed millions of workers to take their place. And it found them.
My husband's a prisoner of the Japs in the Philippines. If he'd had a few more of these shells out in Bataan, maybe he'd still be fighting.
These women hadn't even worn pants before in their lives. I mean, we're talking about doing hot, dirty, heavy, dangerous work.
The women were generally referred to as Rosie, after the song. Margaret Berry went to Boeing in Seattle to make airplanes.
We broke the barrier.
But even during the war, there were barriers. Around Chicago, some companies turned down lucrative defense contracts rather than hire women.
They do a man's job, and they can draw a man's pay. And they're doing it safely.
It was not as clear as the newsreel said. Men, still in factories, got higher pay for the same job. And in the first 18 months of the war, more defense plant workers died in accidents than soldiers at the front. But the country needed them.
If you want your country free, don't be an absentee.
At the end of the war, many of the 18 million women who had served in the factories were dismissed. Returning soldiers needed jobs, and women were told that their place was once again in the home. It was sad for many who wanted to keep their jobs. 60 years later, Margaret Berry and dozens of other Rosies are to be honored in Seattle this weekend. Mrs. Berry says it is an honor to have people not forget the women who after all, help win the war.
I was a veteran, the same as the fellows that we're serving.
That's our report on World News Tonight. Next week on the broadcast, an ABC News investigation of whether the state is protecting children. The discarded computers from the U.S. which are poisoning children, and the mill town which rebuilt itself into the world's car racing capital. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good weekend and good night.